My name is Robert Martinez, and I'm 62 years old. 6 months ago, I lost my wife Margaret after 35 years of marriage to cancer. We built our life together in this house, raised our son Michael here, and I thought this would always be my home. After Margaret passed, Michael and his wife Cheryl moved in to help take care of me during my grief. I was grateful for their support during the darkest time of my life, but I never expected what my own family would do to me. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from, and please hit that like button. Trust me, you'll want to see how this story unfolds. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was to believe that blood always runs thicker than water. Margaret and I had spent 40 years building our dream home from nothing. I remember when we first bought this lot back in 1983. It was just empty land with weeds growing everywhere, but Margaret saw the potential. She had this vision of a white colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch where we could watch our grandchildren play someday. I worked as a construction foreman for Morrison Building Company, and every weekend for 3 years, Margaret and I would come out here with our tools. I taught myself plumbing from library books. Margaret learned how to tile from watching YouTube videos that barely existed back then. We did most of the work ourselves because we couldn't afford to hire contractors. I remember working double shifts during the week, then spending Saturdays and Sundays laying foundation, framing walls, installing electrical. My hands were permanently stained with paint and calloused from hammers. Michael was just 7 years old when we finally moved in. He helped us plant the oak tree in the front yard that now towers over the house. That boy was everything to us. He was never any trouble growing up, always made good grades, played baseball in high school, got a scholarship to State University for engineering. Margaret and I were so proud of him. We always talked about how someday this house would be his, how he'd raise his own family here, keep the tradition going. When Michael graduated college and got his job at the power company, he moved to an apartment across town. But he still came over every Sunday for Margaret's pot roast. That was our tradition for years. Then 3 years ago, he met Cheryl at a work function. She seemed nice enough at first, very polite and well-mannered. She complimented Margaret's cooking, helped with dishes, asked appropriate questions about family history. Margaret liked her immediately, said she reminded her of herself at that age. After they got married 2 years ago, Cheryl would still come to Sunday dinners, but I noticed small changes. She'd make little comments about the house being old-fashioned, suggest we should update the kitchen or replace the carpeting. Margaret would just smile and change the subject, but I could tell it bothered her. Still, we wanted Michael to be happy, so we kept our opinions to ourselves. Then came the diagnosis. Margaret's doctor found the cancer during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The oncologist gave her 6 months, maybe 8 if she was lucky. Those next 6 months were the hardest of my life. Watching the woman I loved waste away while trying to stay strong for her. Michael and Cheryl were supportive during the treatment, driving us to appointments, bringing groceries, sitting with Margaret when I had to work. After Margaret passed in February, I was completely lost. This house that had been filled with her laughter and energy suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Every room had memories that would make me break down crying. The kitchen where she made coffee every morning. The living room where we watched the news together every evening. Our bedroom where she took her last breath while holding my hand. Michael was worried about me living alone in such a big house. He suggested they move in temporarily, just until I got back on my feet emotionally. It seemed like a blessing at the time. The house felt less empty with them there, and Cheryl actually helped me sort through Margaret's belongings, which I couldn't bear to do alone. She was gentle about it, asking what I wanted to keep, what should be donated. I thought she truly cared about my healing process. But within a few weeks, I started noticing small changes that made me uncomfortable. Cheryl would complain that I watched television too loudly in the evenings. She said the sound of me cooking breakfast early in the morning woke them up. She mentioned that the house had too many old smells, like medicine and sadness. At first, I tried to accommodate her requests, using headphones for TV, eating cereal instead of cooking eggs, opening windows to air out rooms. The first real sign of trouble came about 2 months after they moved in. I came home from my part-time job at the hardware store to find that Cheryl had rearranged the living room completely. Margaret's favorite reading chair, the one where she sat every evening with her book and tea, had been moved to the basement. The family photos on the mantel had been replaced with modern art pieces I'd never seen before. The coffee table that Margaret and I had bought at an antique store for our 10th anniversary was gone entirely. When I asked Cheryl about it, she said she was just trying to help me move forward, that keeping everything exactly the same wasn't healthy for my grief process. She'd read articles online about how changing your environment can help with depression. Her tone was so reasonable, so caring, that I felt guilty for being upset. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was holding onto the past too tightly. But then, I noticed that Margaret's friend Dolores had stopped coming by for coffee. Dolores and Margaret had been best friends for 20 years, meeting every Wednesday morning to catch up and share gossip. After the funeral, Dolores continued the tradition, bringing me coffee and checking on my well-being. She'd tell me stories about Margaret that I'd never heard. Funny incidents from their shopping trips or conversations they'd had about their hopes for retirement. One Wednesday, Dolores called to cancel, saying she didn't feel comfortable coming over anymore. When I pressed her for details, she admitted that Cheryl had been cold to her during her last visit, making comments about how I needed to focus on moving forward instead of dwelling in the past with old friends. Cheryl had suggested that Dolores was enabling my depression by constantly bringing up Margaret. I was furious. How dare Cheryl interfere with my friendships, especially with someone who had been so important to Margaret? When I confronted her about it, she denied saying anything inappropriate to Dolores. She claimed that Dolores had misunderstood her concern for my mental health. She even started crying, saying she was only trying to help me heal and that I was being ungrateful for her efforts. Michael, of course, took his wife's side. He said that maybe some distance from reminders of Mom would be good for me. He suggested I should consider seeing a therapist instead of relying on friends to process my grief. His words stung because they implied that I was being unreasonable, that my way of mourning was somehow wrong or unhealthy. The isolation began slowly, so gradually that I didn't recognize it at first. Cheryl would schedule activities or invite people over during times when I was usually home, then suggest I might be more comfortable in my bedroom or the basement while they entertained. She'd clean the kitchen right after I cooked, wiping down surfaces with strong-smelling cleaners that eliminated any trace of the meals I'd prepared. She bought new shower curtains, new towels, new bedding for the guest rooms, systematically erasing Margaret's touches throughout the house. Most painful of all, she convinced Michael that I should give up the master bedroom. She said it wasn't healthy for me to sleep in the same bed where Margaret had died, that I needed a fresh start in a different room. The way she presented it, moving to the guest room, was for my own psychological benefit. But I knew the truth. She wanted that bedroom for herself and Michael. She wanted to be the lady of the house, and my presence in the master suite was a reminder that this was still my home, not hers. I started spending more time at the hardware store, picking up extra shifts, just to avoid the tension at home. My coworkers noticed that I seemed different, more withdrawn and sad than even during the worst days of Margaret's illness. When they asked about my living situation, I found myself making excuses for Cheryl's behavior, saying she was just trying to help, that it was difficult for everyone to adjust to the new arrangements. But late at night, lying in the guest room that had become my exile, I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder how my life had become so small. I was a stranger in the house I'd built with my own hands, walking on eggshells around a woman who smiled to my face while systematically erasing my wife's memory and my place in my own home. The situation escalated dramatically in May, about 3 months after Michael and Cheryl had moved in. I was working in the garden one Saturday morning, planting the tomatoes that Margaret and I had always grown together, when I overheard Cheryl talking on her phone in the kitchen. The window was open, and her voice carried clearly across the yard. She was talking to her mother, describing her frustrations with our living arrangement. But what I heard made my blood run cold. She wasn't just complaining about minor inconveniences. She was outlining a strategy to get me out of the house permanently. "He's so stubborn about everything," she said. "He acts like this is still his house when clearly Michael and I need our space to start our family." I've been dropping hints about assisted living communities, showing him brochures about how active seniors can benefit from structured activities and medical support. But he's not taking the hint. There was a pause while her mother responded, then Cheryl continued. "Michael keeps saying we should be patient, that his dad is still grieving and needs time. But honestly, how much time does grief require? It's been months since his wife died. At some point, he needs to accept reality and move on. And the reality is that this house is too big for one old man. Michael and I could use the space, and frankly, the sooner Robert accepts that, the better it will be for everyone. I crept closer to the window, my heart pounding as I listened to her outline her plan. She had researched several retirement communities in the area, places that offered different levels of care, from independent living to full nursing home services. She had even called a few to inquire about availability and costs, telling them she was asking for her father-in-law, who was having difficulty managing his home after his wife's death. The best part is, once he's settled somewhere else, Michael and I can really make this place our own, she said with a laugh that chilled me to the bone. I've been looking at Pinterest boards for months, planning how to renovate the master bedroom and turn that awful basement into a proper family room. Michael doesn't know it yet, but I'm already pregnant. We're going to need this space for the nursery, and I don't want some depressed old man hanging around while I'm trying to raise children. Pregnant. She was pregnant and hadn't even told her husband yet, but she'd already decided that I needed to be removed from the picture to make room for their expanding family. The casual cruelty in her voice as she described me as some depressed old man was devastating. This was the woman who had held my hand at Margaret's funeral, who had assured me that I would always be part of their family. When she finished her phone call, I stayed hidden in the garden for another hour, trying to process what I'd heard. Part of me wanted to march into the house immediately and confront her, demand an explanation for her deception and manipulation. But another part of me, the part that had been worn down by months of subtle psychological warfare, wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe I was being selfish, clinging to a house that was too big for one person while preventing my son from building his own life. That evening, I decided to test my suspicions by bringing up the topic of living arrangements casually during dinner. I mentioned that I'd been thinking about the future, wondering if the house might be too much for me to maintain as I got older. Michael immediately looked uncomfortable, glancing at Cheryl before assuring me that I shouldn't worry about such things, that we were all family and would figure everything out together. But Cheryl's response was different. Her eyes lit up with interest, and she began enthusiastically describing the benefits of senior living communities. She had brochures ready, as if she'd been waiting for this opportunity. She talked about social activities, meal plans, housekeeping services, medical support, all the things that would make my life easier and more fulfilling. Her presentation was so polished, so well-researched, that it was obvious she'd been planning this conversation for weeks. Michael seemed surprised by his wife's extensive knowledge of retirement housing options, but he didn't question it. Instead, he started agreeing with her points, talking about how much easier it would be for me not to worry about house maintenance, property taxes, lawn care, all the responsibilities that came with homeownership. They made it sound like moving out would be a gift I was giving myself, a chance to embrace a new chapter of life without burdens. But I wasn't fooled anymore. I could see the calculation behind Cheryl's concerned expressions, the way she steered the conversation toward specific facilities she'd obviously already researched. This wasn't about my well-being or happiness. This was about clearing me out of the way so she could take over the house I'd spent 40 years building. The next few weeks were tense as Cheryl increased the pressure. She'd leave brochures for retirement communities on the kitchen counter where I couldn't miss them. She'd make comments about how difficult it must be for me to keep up with housework and yard maintenance. She'd suggest that I was isolating myself too much, that I'd be happier around people my own age who understood what I was going through. Michael, caught between his wife's campaign and his loyalty to me, became increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He'd changed the subject when Cheryl brought up senior living, but he wouldn't directly oppose her suggestions either. I could see that he was torn, wanting to support his wife's vision for their future, while also feeling guilty about displacing his father. The breaking point came when Cheryl made the mistake of being too obvious about her intentions. She scheduled a tour of a retirement community without telling me, then announced at breakfast that we had an appointment that afternoon to look at available units. She presented it as a fact, not a request, assuming that I would simply go along with her plan because she'd decided it was time. That's when I finally found my voice and told her exactly what I thought about her manipulation and scheming. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening in late May. I had spent the day thinking about everything I'd observed over the past months, all the small manipulations and calculated moves that Cheryl had made to push me toward leaving. When I came home from the hardware store that evening, I found her in the kitchen, talking on the phone with someone about paint colors and furniture arrangements. She was describing plans for redecorating the master bedroom, discussing whether to go with a modern minimalist look or something more traditional. When she saw me, she quickly ended the call and smiled brightly, as if nothing unusual had happened. That false cheerfulness was the last straw. I asked her to sit down because we needed to have an honest conversation about what was really happening in this house. I told her that I'd overheard her phone conversation with her mother weeks earlier, that I knew about her pregnancy and her plans to get me out of the house. I explained that I'd seen through all her manipulative tactics, from moving Margaret's furniture to driving away my friends, to pressuring me about retirement communities. I said that I was tired of being treated like an unwelcome guest in my own home. Cheryl's reaction was swift and dramatic. She immediately burst into tears, claiming that I had misunderstood everything, that I was paranoid and possibly suffering from some kind of mental decline related to grief. She said that all her suggestions about senior living had been motivated by genuine concern for my well-being, that she wanted me to be happy and social instead of isolated and depressed. She denied being pregnant, denied having any conversation with her mother about getting me out of the house, denied everything I accused her of with such convincing emotion that for a moment I almost believed her. She was a skilled actress, able to summon tears and righteous indignation on command. She talked about how hurt she was that I would think so poorly of her after everything she'd done to help me through my grief. When Michael came home from work and found his wife crying, he immediately assumed that I had done something to upset her. Cheryl told him a version of our conversation that painted me as the aggressor, saying that I had accused her of trying to steal the house and force me into a nursing home. She made it sound like I was having some kind of paranoid episode, possibly related to depression or early-stage dementia. Michael was shocked and concerned. He sat me down for a serious conversation about my mental state, asking if I'd been taking my blood pressure medication regularly, if I'd been sleeping well, if the grief was affecting my judgment. He suggested that maybe I should see a doctor for a complete physical and mental health evaluation. The implication was clear. He believed his wife's version of events over mine. That night I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and feeling more alone than I had since Margaret's death. My own son didn't believe me. He thought I was losing my mind, becoming paranoid and delusional in my old age. Cheryl had successfully positioned herself as the reasonable, caring daughter-in-law while making me look like the problem. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Cheryl would speak to me in the overly patient tone people use with confused elderly relatives, asking repeatedly if I was feeling all right, if I needed anything, if there was anything she could do to help me feel more comfortable. Michael watched me constantly, as if he expected me to have another episode at any moment. They began having whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. I'd catch them looking at me with expressions of concern and pity, as if I were a sick animal that might need to be put down for its own good. The psychological pressure was intense, designed to make me question my own sanity and judgment. But I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't imagining things. I knew what I had heard, and I knew what Cheryl was trying to do. The problem was that she was better at manipulation than I was at proving her deception. She had turned my son against me using my own grief as a weapon, convincing him that my accusations were symptoms of mental decline rather than legitimate concerns about her behavior. The final insult came when I discovered that Cheryl had called my doctor's office, claiming to be concerned about my mental state. She described my paranoid accusations and asked if there were warning signs of dementia that family members should watch for. The receptionist, thinking she was being helpful, had mailed brochures about Alzheimer's disease and depression in seniors to the house. When I found them in the mail, I realized that Cheryl was building a case against my competency, creating a paper trail that would support her narrative that I was becoming unfit to live independently. That's when I knew I had to take action before she succeeded in having me declared mentally incompetent and forced into a care facility against my will. The morning that changed everything was a Saturday in early June. I woke up to the sound of a truck in the driveway and voices on the front porch. When I looked out the window, I saw a moving truck and several people carrying boxes and furniture toward the house. My first thought was that we were receiving a delivery, but then I saw Cheryl directing the movers with the confidence of someone who had planned this operation carefully. I rushed downstairs to find out what was happening, and discovered that Cheryl's parents, Wanda and Harold, had arrived with a truck full of their belongings. They were moving in permanently without anyone bothering to inform me or ask for my permission. Cheryl greeted me with a bright smile and announced that her parents were going to be staying with us to help with the transition. When I asked what transition she was talking about, she explained matter-of-factly that they had all decided it would be best for everyone if I moved out as soon as possible. She said that Michael had agreed it was time for me to embrace the next chapter of my life in a senior living community where I could get the support and social interaction I needed. Her parents were there to help with the household, while Michael and I worked out the details of my relocation. I was stunned by the audacity of it. Not only had she arranged for her parents to move into my house without consulting me, but she was presenting my eviction as a fait accompli, something that had already been decided by the family. Michael was at work, conveniently absent during this ambush, leaving me to deal with his wife and her parents alone. Wanda, Cheryl's mother, was a large woman with steel-gray hair and a voice that could cut glass. She immediately began criticizing everything about the house, from the outdated kitchen appliances to the old-fashioned wallpaper in the dining room. She made it clear that she considered the house shabby and in need of major renovations, which they would obviously handle once I was no longer taking up space. Harold, her father, was quieter but equally presumptuous. He started measuring rooms and making notes about furniture placement, acting as if he were already planning his permanent residence in my home. When I objected to his surveying activities, he told me not to worry about it, that these changes wouldn't affect me since I'd be moving out soon anyway. The three of them worked together like a well-coordinated team, each playing their role in the operation to remove me from my own house. Cheryl maintained her facade of caring concern, talking about how much happier I'd be in a place designed for people my age. Wanda provided the harsh practical pressure, making cutting remarks about how I was obviously unable to maintain such a large property properly. Harold offered the silent intimidation of his presence, a reminder that I was now outnumbered in my own home. They gave me until the end of the day to pack my essential belongings and find somewhere else to stay. Cheryl had already called several retirement communities and found one with an immediate opening for a short-term resident. She presented it as a trial period, a chance for me to experience senior living before making a permanent commitment. But I understood that once I left, I would never be allowed to return. When I protested that this was my house, that I had legal rights as the owner, Cheryl's mask slipped for just a moment. She told me coldly that Michael was the one with the stable job and the ability to maintain the property, that it made more sense for the house to belong to people who could actually take care of it. She suggested that my emotional attachment to the building was unhealthy, and that I needed to let go of the past for my own good. The humiliation of packing my belongings while Cheryl's parents supervised was devastating. They watched me like guards, making sure I didn't take anything they considered valuable or important. Wanda went through Margaret's jewelry box, deciding which pieces should stay with the house and which ones I could take. Harold looked through my tools in the garage, selecting which ones he might find useful for house maintenance. By evening, I was standing on the front porch with 2 suitcases and a small box of photographs, preparing to leave the home I had built with my own hands. The neighbors who witnessed my departure looked confused and concerned, but no one intervened. From their perspective, it appeared that I was simply moving out to live with other family members or in a retirement facility. They had no way of knowing that I was being forcibly evicted by my own son's wife. Michael came home just as I was calling a taxi to take me to the motel where I'd made a reservation. When he saw me with my suitcases, he looked genuinely shocked and upset. Cheryl quickly explained that I had decided it was time to try the retirement community, that I'd had a good day looking at my options and was excited about the new adventure. She made it sound like this was my choice, my decision to embrace independence and social opportunities. Michael hugged me goodbye with tears in his eyes, promising that this was just temporary, that we'd figure out a better long-term solution once I'd had time to adjust and settle in. He said he loved me and wanted me to be happy, that if the retirement place didn't work out, we'd find something else that did. His sincerity was heartbreaking, because I could see that he genuinely believed he was doing what was best for me. As the taxi drove away from the house where I'd spent the happiest years of my life, I looked back to see Cheryl and her parents standing in the doorway, already planning the changes they would make now that the obstacle of my presence had been removed. They were smiling and animated, excited about their victory and the opportunities it represented. That night, in a dingy motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaning products, I sat on the sagging bed and tried to process what had happened to my life. In the span of one day, I had gone from being a homeowner to being essentially homeless, from being a father and father-in-law to being an unwanted burden that had been discarded for the convenience of others. But as I sat there in that depressing room, surrounded by the few possessions I'd been allowed to take from my own house, I felt something unexpected, a spark of anger that grew into a flame of determination. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I wasn't going to disappear quietly into some retirement facility while they took over the life I had built. If they wanted to play games with legal ownership and family loyalty, I would show them exactly what those concepts really meant. The first thing I did the next morning was find a lawyer. I spent Sunday at the motel, making phone calls and researching my options online. By Monday morning, I had an appointment with David Steinberg, an attorney who specialized in elder law and property rights. His office was in a professional building downtown, and when I walked in wearing my best suit, carrying a folder full of documents, I felt more like myself than I had in months. David listened to my story with growing amazement and anger. He explained that what Cheryl and her family had done was not only morally wrong, but potentially illegal. Since I was the sole owner of the house, with the deed in my name and no other parties listed, they had no legal right to force me out or to make decisions about the property without my consent. The fact that they had moved additional people into the house without my permission could be considered trespassing. He reviewed the paperwork I'd brought, the original mortgage documents, the deed showing clear title in my name alone, property tax records, insurance policies, everything that proved my ownership. Margaret's name had been removed from all legal documents after her death, leaving me as the undisputed owner. Even though Michael lived there and contributed to household expenses, he had no legal claim to the property. David suggested that the most effective way to handle the situation would be to sell the house immediately, before Cheryl and her family could establish any kind of residency rights or claim of adverse possession. He explained that some states had laws protecting tenants who had been living in a property for extended periods, even without formal lease agreements. The sooner I acted, the stronger my legal position would be. The idea of selling the house was emotionally devastating. This was the home Margaret and I had built together, the place where we'd raised Michael, where we'd planned to spend our retirement years. Every room held memories of birthdays, holidays, quiet evenings, and shared dreams. But I realized that those memories had already been tainted by what had happened. The house had been turned into a weapon against me, and keeping it would mean continued warfare with people who had shown they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. David recommended a real estate agent he'd worked with before, a woman named Priscilla Thompson, who specialized in quick sales and had a reputation for handling difficult family situations with discretion. When I met with Priscilla that afternoon, she was sympathetic but practical. She explained that the current market was favorable to sellers, and that my house was in a desirable neighborhood that would attract multiple offers. After walking through the property and evaluating its condition, Priscilla estimated that we could list it for significantly more than I'd expected. The improvements Margaret and I had made over the years, combined with the rising real estate values in the area, meant that the house was worth almost 3 times what we'd originally paid for it. The money from the sale would be enough to buy a smaller place outright and still leave me with substantial savings for retirement. Within 2 days, Priscilla had found potential buyers, a young couple named James and Paula Williams who were looking for a family home in exactly this neighborhood. They had been pre-approved for a mortgage and were prepared to make a cash offer if necessary. When they toured the house on Wednesday evening, while Cheryl and her parents were out celebrating their victory with dinner at an expensive restaurant, they fell in love with the property and agreed to my asking price. The speed of events was exhilarating. After months of feeling powerless and manipulated, I was suddenly taking decisive action that would completely change the situation. James and Paula were excited about the house and eager to close as quickly as possible. They had already sold their previous home and were staying in corporate housing while they searched for something permanent. They could close within 2 weeks if all the paperwork was completed promptly. I spent the rest of the week preparing for what I knew would be a dramatic confrontation. I bought new clothes that made me feel confident and professional. I got a haircut and had my car detailed. I wanted to look like a successful businessman, not the defeated old man who had been driven from his home the previous weekend. I practiced what I would say, how I would present the situation calmly and factually, without letting emotion undermine my position. Priscilla suggested that we coordinate the confrontation with the closing date to maximize the psychological impact. If I appeared at the house with the new owners and the attorney, it would be impossible for Cheryl to deny the reality of what was happening or to claim that this was just another one of my paranoid episodes. The presence of legal professionals and official paperwork would make it clear that this was not a negotiation or a family discussion, but a business transaction that was already completed. On Friday, I drove by the house to see what was happening and discovered that they were planning some kind of party for Saturday evening. There were decorations being delivered, catering supplies on the porch, and a rental company setting up tables and chairs in the backyard. From what I could observe, it looked like they were throwing a housewarming party, celebrating their successful takeover of my property with friends and family. The irony was perfect. They would be in the middle of celebrating their victory when I arrived to announce their defeat. All their guests would witness the moment when their triumph turned to humiliation. The party they had planned to mark their new beginning would instead become the scene of their eviction notice. That night, I called Dolores, Margaret's old friend, to let her know what was happening. She was shocked by the story and furious about how I'd been treated. She offered to help in any way she could, including being present during the confrontation as a witness and for moral support. Her loyalty to Margaret's memory and her genuine concern for my welfare reminded me that not everyone in the world was selfish and manipulative like Cheryl. As I prepared for sleep on Friday night, I felt more hopeful than I had since Margaret's death. Tomorrow would be the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. I would finally have justice for the way I'd been treated, and more importantly, I would have my dignity back. Saturday arrived with perfect weather, sunny and warm, ideal for an outdoor party. I spent the morning making final preparations, reviewing documents with David, and coordinating timing with Priscilla and the new owners. We agreed to arrive at the house at 3 o'clock, when the party would be in full swing but before the evening activities began. The goal was maximum impact with minimum disruption to the neighbors. James and Paula Williams were nervous about the confrontation, but they were also excited about officially taking possession of their new home. They had brought their 2 young children, thinking it would help demonstrate that they were a legitimate family who would love and care for the house properly. David had prepared all the necessary legal documents, including the sale contract, closing papers, and a formal notice of eviction for the current unauthorized occupants. As we drove up to the house at exactly 3 o'clock, I could see that the party was well underway. There were probably 30 people in the backyard, with music playing and food being served from a catering table. Children were playing on the lawn, and adults were standing around in small groups, drinks in hand, clearly having a good time. From their perspective, this was a celebration of Cheryl and Michael's new life in their beautiful family home. Dolores had arrived separately and was waiting for us in her car across the street. She got out when she saw us approaching, and her presence gave me additional confidence. She had known Margaret and me for 20 years, had been in this house countless times, and could testify to the truth of my ownership and the legitimacy of my claims. I walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell, even though it felt strange to ring the bell at my own house. After a moment, Cheryl opened the door with a bright party hostess smile, expecting to greet another guest. When she saw me standing there with a group of strangers, her expression changed dramatically. The color drained from her face and she took a step backward, clearly shocked by my unexpected appearance. "Hello, Cheryl," I said calmly. "I'd like you to meet the new owners of this house. The sale closes Monday morning." For a moment she was speechless, staring at me as if I were a ghost who had returned to haunt her celebration. Then she found her voice and started protesting loudly, attracting the attention of party guests who had been enjoying themselves moments before. "You can't do this," she shouted. "This is our home. You can't just sell it without telling us." "Actually, I can," I replied, maintaining my calm tone. "This is my house. My name is on the deed, I pay the taxes and insurance, and I have every legal right to sell it to whomever I choose. David here is my attorney, and he has all the paperwork to prove it." Michael appeared beside his wife, looking confused and alarmed. "Dad, what's going on? What are you talking about selling the house?" "I'm talking about the fact that your wife and her parents threw me out of my own home last weekend," I said, making sure my voice was loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "They moved in without my permission, gave me until the end of the day to pack my belongings, and sent me to live in a motel. So I decided to sell the house to people who will appreciate it properly." The conversation was attracting more attention as party guests realized that something dramatic was happening. Wanda and Harold pushed through the crowd, demanding to know what was going on. When they saw the attorney and the young family with their children, they seemed to understand immediately that their plans had been disrupted. Priscilla stepped forward and introduced herself as the real estate agent, explaining that the sale was legitimate and legal, that all proper procedures had been followed, and that the new owners would be taking possession within 2 weeks. She handed Cheryl a formal notice that had been prepared by the attorney, informing all current residents that they needed to vacate the premises by the specified date. The party atmosphere evaporated completely, as guests realized they were witnessing a family crisis. Some people began making excuses to leave, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others gathered closer, curious about the drama unfolding before them. Children stopped playing and moved closer to their parents, sensing that something important and upsetting was happening. Michael was devastated, torn between loyalty to his wife and shock at what I was telling him. "Dad, we can work this out," he said desperately. "You don't have to sell the house. We can figure out another arrangement." "The time for working things out was before your wife had me evicted," I replied. "The time for other arrangements was before she moved her parents into my house without asking." "The contracts are signed, Michael. The new owners have already put down their deposit. This sale is happening whether Cheryl likes it or not." James Williams, the new owner, spoke up to confirm that they were serious buyers who intended to take possession of the property as scheduled. He was polite but firm, explaining that they had sold their previous home and made commitments based on this purchase. There was no backing out now, even if they wanted to, which they didn't. Cheryl was becoming increasingly hysterical, alternating between tears and angry accusations. She claimed that I was having a mental breakdown, that I wasn't competent to make such important decisions, that the sale should be invalidated because I was clearly not in my right mind. But David was prepared for these arguments, and calmly explained that I had been evaluated by medical professionals who had confirmed my mental competency to enter into legal contracts. The confrontation lasted for nearly an hour, with various family members and friends trying to mediate or understand what was happening. But the bottom line was simple. I owned the house, I had the legal right to sell it, and the sale was going to proceed as planned. No amount of arguing or pleading was going to change that fundamental reality. As we prepared to leave, I looked around at the party decorations and the confused guests, at the catering table and the rental chairs, at all the trappings of a celebration that had turned into a wake. "You have 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live," I told Cheryl. "I suggest you start looking immediately." The aftermath of that confrontation was both satisfying and bittersweet. Within hours, word had spread throughout the neighborhood about what had happened at the party. Some people were shocked by the drama. Others were supportive of my decision to stand up for myself. A few neighbors admitted that they had been uncomfortable with how quickly Cheryl had taken over the house after Margaret's death, but they hadn't felt it was their place to interfere in family business. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched from a distance as Cheryl and her parents scrambled to find new living arrangements. The process was not easy for them, since they had expected to be settled permanently and hadn't prepared for the possibility of having to move quickly. Michael took time off work to help with apartment hunting and packing, clearly stressed by the situation but committed to supporting his wife despite everything that had happened. Dolores kept me informed about the neighborhood gossip and the family's progress. She told me that Cheryl had been telling people I was senile and vindictive, that I had sold the house out of spite without considering the impact on my own son. But other neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation spread a different version of the story, one that painted me as a man who had been pushed too far and finally fought back. The closing went smoothly, with all parties meeting at David's office to sign the final paperwork. James and Paula were excited about starting their new life in the house, and they assured me that they would take good care of the property. They promised to maintain Margaret's garden and to respect the history and memories that the house represented. Their children were already planning which rooms would be theirs and talking about the treehouse they wanted to build in the backyard. As I signed the deed transfer, I felt a mixture of grief and relief. This house had been the center of my life for 40 years, but it had also become a source of pain and conflict. Selling it felt like finally closing the door on a chapter that had ended badly, giving me the opportunity to start fresh somewhere else, without the constant reminders of betrayal and manipulation. With the proceeds from the sale, I was able to purchase a small condominium near the coast, about 30 miles from my old neighborhood. It was a modern unit in a community designed for active seniors, with amenities like a fitness center, library, and social activities. The location was perfect, close to the beach where Margaret and I had spent our honeymoon and had talked about retiring someday. Moving into the condo felt like the beginning of a new life. The space was smaller but more manageable, decorated with the few belongings I had been able to save from the house, plus some new furniture that reflected my current needs rather than my past. I kept Margaret's photographs and a few of her favorite books, but I also made room for new interests and activities. 3 months after the sale, Michael called me for the first time since the confrontation. His voice was shaky and emotional as he apologized for what had happened, admitting that he'd been blind to his wife's manipulation and had failed in his duty as a son. He told me that Cheryl had never been pregnant, that she had lied about that, along with many other things. Their marriage was falling apart under the stress of what had happened, and he was beginning to see her true character clearly for the first time. I listened to his apologies with mixed feelings. Part of me was glad that he finally understood what Cheryl had done to our family, but another part of me was sad that it had taken such extreme measures to open his eyes. I told him that I forgave him, but that our relationship would need time to heal. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair itself overnight. Michael and Cheryl divorced 6 months later. She moved back in with her parents, taking with her whatever settlement she could negotiate from their brief marriage. Michael found an apartment across town and threw himself into his work, trying to rebuild his life and his relationship with me slowly and carefully. We began meeting for coffee once a month, neutral territory where we could talk without the pressure of shared living space or complicated family dynamics. These conversations were sometimes difficult, but they were also healing. Michael was genuinely remorseful about his failure to protect me from his wife's schemes, and he was committed to earning back my trust and respect. The condo community turned out to be exactly what I needed during this period of transition. I joined the chess club and discovered I had a talent for the game that I'd never explored. I started taking cooking classes, learning to prepare meals for one person instead of the large family dinners Margaret had always made. I even began dating, something I never thought I'd do again after losing my wife. Her name was Mildred, a widow about my age who had moved to the community after her husband's death 2 years earlier. She was intelligent, funny, and completely uninterested in taking advantage of anyone. We enjoyed each other's company without any of the drama or manipulation that had characterized my recent experiences with family. She helped me remember that not all relationships were based on power struggles and selfish motives. 1 year after selling the house, I drove by the old neighborhood to see how James and Paula were settling in. The property looked beautiful, with new landscaping and a fresh coat of paint on the shutters. Children's toys were scattered on the lawn, and I could see a swing set in the backyard where Margaret's garden used to be. It was clearly a home where a young family was thriving, which is exactly what Margaret and I had always hoped it would be. I realized that morning that I had made the right decision, both in selling the house and in refusing to be a victim of other people's greed and manipulation. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes the only way to preserve your dignity is to walk away from people who don't respect it, even when those people are family. Standing there looking at my former home, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing from my life for months. Margaret would have been proud of me for standing up for myself, for refusing to be pushed around by people who saw me as weak and disposable. She always said that I was stronger than I knew, and I had finally proven her right. The lesson I learned from this experience is that family loyalty goes both ways. You can't demand respect and love from people while treating them with cruelty and disregard. Cheryl made the mistake of thinking that marriage to my son gave her the right to control my life and my property. She underestimated my willingness to fight back when pushed too far. If you're going through something similar, remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. Stand up for yourself even when it's difficult, even when it costs you relationships that you thought were important. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself again. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace in your family and standing up for what's right? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming adversity. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's never too late to fight for your dignity and self-respect. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that every ending is also a new beginning. Take care of yourselves, and don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve better.